Nightmare Creatures is a third-person survival horror game where you play as either of two protagonists as they chase down Adam Crowley after he releases a plague onto the dark streets of London, turning its inhabitants into untold horrors. The game is available on PlayStation 1, PC, and Nintendo 64. Atmosphere. Nightmare Creatures takes place in early 19th century London, and its gothic look really can be spooky. The game doesn't use too many environments, but it does give in to stereotypes, though it's still fun and exciting to explore the nasty, pixelated scenery. There are bloodstains on the floor and chains hanging from the ceilings in the dungeons. The once packed streets are eerie and empty, and the sewers are filled with human-sized spider people. The game's atmosphere goes quite far on aesthetics alone, but there really are only a few moments that you spend alone. The game has the typical PlayStation draw distance, with things beyond that point being enveloped in darkness, which works well for the game's combat, setting you up over and over. And the game is filled with combat, repeatedly having you fight for your life and dealing with dangers. Enemies smash through walls to attack you and lurk in wait around every corner. This itself creates a lot of tension as the game can get pretty hard, and it's not clear where the next assault will come from. Though one of the game's problems is the adrenaline meter on the left-hand side of the screen. It starts to decrease unless you kill something, and your character starts to take damage once it depletes. This is in the game to represent your resistance to the plague, and thematically it sort of makes sense, but it gives you a lot less time to explore the environments and look for items. This, and the game's difficulty, and the relentless attacking enemies do cause problems with appreciating the atmosphere sometimes. Generally though, the PlayStation aesthetic and the spooky streets of a darkened, abandoned London work surprisingly well to create this sense of tension and dread as you desperately fight your way through it. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game only really uses combat to frighten the player, along with random things falling from the ceiling. And whilst the latter only provides a small amount of shock, the combat is a different thing altogether. For the era the game is from, it's not surprising to learn that the combat can be pretty difficult, and sometimes unfair, mostly due to how the movement is still based around tank controls. Enemies differ greatly in the way they attack and attack you, with some being highly defensive and others being overtly aggressive. Many can attack you at the same time, and things like falling into a water is an instant loss of a life. There are no checkpoints, but when you die, you're brought back where you died. Running out of lives, however, means restarting the level, and some of the levels are very long and maze-like. The boss fights are sometimes confusing and brutally unfair, but generally when the combat is good, the combat can be fun. Using power-ups like the saw blade can strip any threat you're dealing with of all its limbs and kill it in seconds, and guns can one-shot most enemies. But as stated earlier, taking the time to find these things is not something the game gives you much time to do. Whether the combat is frightening, frustrating, or bewildering is down to the situation. Low health and a tough, aggressive enemy can be nerve-wracking, and an enemy dodging around you to push you straight into nearby water can be supremely frustrating. The combat is all the game has to scare you, and it's extremely hit or miss with how it works. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The low bitrate grunts and groans of the monsters and your character's punching and kicking noises as you repeatedly pummel your enemies play with each hit, which is oddly satisfying. Other sound effects like the rumbling earthquakes and special weapons are just fun to hear. There's a lot of ambient sounds in the game as well, with fires crackling and the sound of water as you approach the docks, that just help the immersion. The game's soundtrack is quite small, but each has a fun vibe to it, with the pulsing dread of a bass guitar echoing over the soft, unnerving string sections and that angelic choir of people's voices. Everything sounds woeful, and the minor chords and the X-Files style synth strings keep on adding more and more to the atmosphere. The soundtrack also comes with baked-in sound effects as well, with wolves howling and people whispering that are undoubtedly cheesy, but still very fun. There's voice acting for the narrator, and that's about it, but I'm not sure if even Vincent Price could have done a better job of hyping up the game's intro.
He works alone, his hands defiling the bodies of the dead in his thirst for knowledge and power. His name is Adam Crowley, a man who was once respected in the field of science, until fate led him along another path, towards black magic. Now he is in possession of the mythical Lost Diary of Samuel Pepys, a volume that contains the detestable rituals of the demon-worshipping Brotherhood of Hecate.
There's also a really wonderful reverb to the game when you're walking through the sewers, with each step echoing surprisingly realistically as you walk the brick tunnels. The sound design is a product of its time, but it's one that clearly a lot of love went into. That's two Harry Masons. Gore. There's a lot of blood in the game, with splatters of it coming out during combat all the time. Slicing the zombies in half leaves a satisfying trail as the top and bottom half of the walking corpse divide. Blood also pools underneath the bodies of the fallen foes, and even the pause menu is just a bloodstain with text over it. Along with the dismembering saw blade, the game is satisfyingly bloody and never over the top nor underwhelming. That's three Harry Masons. Story. 1839, Adam Crowley lurks in his basement defiling corpses. A once heralded scientist turned black magic user that will do anything for knowledge and power unleashes a plague onto the city of London that transforms the citizens into monsters. From playing the game, there's not much to the story at all, with the only thing to keep it going being Crowley's few appearances in the levels to slow you down, to the loading screens where a single line of text explains what's happening next as you follow Crowley to the next level. There really could have been more done to this. There were points after defeating a boss I was expecting a cutscene or something to explain more about what was happening, but there was no such luck. The game's manual, however, goes into great detail talking about playable characters, Crowley, enemies, and the large backstory that really does make the events of the game make considerably more sense. However, barely of the contents of the manual can be found by just playing the game. It wasn't even explained during the game what the adrenaline meter was for, nor is it stated what Crowley did or where the monsters came from, since the plague that sets the game off wasn't mentioned in the game from my playthrough. The manual is essential to not just appreciating but understanding the story, and in this day and age it's not something that everyone is going to have access to. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Nightmare Creatures is a challenging game that borders on frustrating, but it's got an incredible atmosphere, and when it's good, it's very good. My copy didn't come with the manual, but luckily there are digital versions online so you can understand the things that the game itself missed out on. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I defeated Crowley, I didn't give in to the plague and advise you don't either. There are more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.